Good morning, guest of honor, Mr. Dilip Nair, Your Excellencies, the High Commissioners and Ambassador of the nations present today, Mr. J.A. Ayaduri, Chairman of the Commemoration Committee, families of veterans from Singapore and around the world, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ceremony to mark the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore during World War II. For those tuning in the live stream, particularly from overseas, welcome to Kranji War Cemetery in Singapore. My name is Eisen Teo, and I'm a senior researcher at Singapore History Consultants. I will be your master of ceremonies this morning. 80 years ago today, the fall of Singapore sent shockwaves throughout the world. Touted as the Gibraltar of the East, the island was captured after just 70 days of ferocious fighting in Malaya and Singapore. Over 120,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied armed forces became prisoners of war on this island. On this significant date in the history of Singapore and the region, we are gathered here to pay tribute to the thousands of gallant men and women from many nations who had fought in the defense of Malaya and Singapore. In particular, we will be honoring the memories of those who made the supreme sacrifice and laid down their lives for their nations. To quote Francis Walker, a brigadier general in the Union Army during the American Civil War, "We come not to mourn our dead soldiers, but to praise them." We also recognize the suffering and the sacrifice made by civilians of all combatant nations involved in the Pacific War. To begin today's proceedings, we have our first reading of the morning, based on an excerpt taken from Pericles' eulogy. Pericles was a general and statesman from ancient Greece. He wrote the eulogy around 431 BCE to honor those who had died in the Peloponnesian War, fought between the two leading city-states of ancient Greece, Athens and Sparta. Today, it is a tradition to recite these moving words at remembrance ceremonies. To read Pericles' eulogy, I call upon the Defense Advisor at the High Commission of Canada, Colonel John Pumphrey. Colonel Pumphrey, please.
These are the words of Pericles. Each has won a glorious grave, not that sepulchre of earth wherein they lie, the living tomb of everlasting remembrance, wherein their glory is enshrined. For the whole world is the sepulchre of heroes. Monuments may rise and tablets be set up to them in their own land, but on the far-off shores there is an abiding memorial that no pen or chisel has traced. It is graven not on stone or brass, but on the living hearts of humanity. Take these men, for example. Like them. Remember that prosperity can be only for the free, that freedom is the sure possession of those alone who have courage to defend it. These are the words of Pericles.
Thank you, Colonel Pumphrey. Our guest of honor for today is Mr. Dilip Nair, a former diplomat with over 40 years of experience in public service, international diplomacy, financial services, and corporate leadership. Mr. Nair reached the highest echelons for a Singaporean when he became Under Secretary General at the United Nations. He served under then Secretary General Kofi Annan. I invite Mr. Nair to share with us a few words. Mr. Nair, please.
Excellencies and members of the Diplomatic Corps, Organizing Committee, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Sunday, the 15th of February, dawned on a city in ruins. Emerging from the air raid shelter, we stared in horror at the sight that met our eyes. A number of military trucks lay overturned on the road. A few yards away, a bomb had fallen, creating a crater. A two-story house that stood there had been flattened. We knew the families that stayed there. They were probably dead. Thus begins chapter 10 of a book on the fall of Singapore and the Japanese occupation. It was written by an Indian woman who was 21 years old then. That Indian woman also happened to be my mother. To many of us, war is something that we only read about, see in movies, or watch on TV. Not many have lived through the horrors of it, but it's real, traumatic, and painful. Today marks the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. Commemorating the event, I think, is important for three reasons. First, it underscores the need for self-defense. The so-called impregnable Singapore fell because of hubris. There was an overconfidence in the defense of the island. Preparing for self-defense should never be taken for granted or ever outsourced. Preparing it has indeed, in Singapore, defense has long been an ongoing effort, especially when you have so many generations of Singaporeans for whom conflict is so far removed. Hence, our government's policy on preparing ourselves through total defense. A second reason this commemoration is important is because people of so many nationalities died in the conflict. British, Indians, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and of course, Singaporeans. As the poet John Donne said, no man is an island. We live in an interconnected world. We need friends, allies, like-minded people who will come to our aid when help is needed. For that reason, we have the Five Power Defense Arrangement, or FPDA. Equally important, we keep being very active in the United Nations. Should any issues of survival arise, we must be able to quickly bring it up to the attention of the Security Council. This commemoration, of course, is heavy on remembrance. But what's equally important is the act of reconciliation. This, I think, is the third reason why this event is significant. With reconciliation, we show that we are moving on. As the book of Ecclesiastes says, there's a time for war and there's a time for peace. Likewise, the profound message of Hinduism's Bhagavad Gita is Nishkama Karma, which means acting without attachment in order to be embraced all the world we have with love. Perhaps Abraham Lincoln best summarized reconciliation when he said, I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends. Finally, allow me to congratulate the Commemoration Committee, chaired by Jaya Ayadure, for organizing this event. Such events, of course, foster a culture of remembrance within our society by honoring our fallen. I'm also heartened to note the presence of His Excellency Yamazaki-san, the Japanese ambassador, and the participation of the Japanese community here. This, I think, more than anything, underscores the act of reconciliation and healing that's so very much needed today. So let's pray that peace prevails in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nair. I now invite religious leaders from 7 major faiths to come forward to conduct simultaneous silent prayers of remembrance. They are representatives of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Sikhism. Thank you, religious leaders. We now come to our second reading this morning, the Kohima Epitaph. In April 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army's advance into India was halted at Impal and Kohima in India. In particular, Kohima saw some of the most bitter fighting of the whole Burma campaign. Today, in the cemetery at Kohima lies 1,000 420 Commonwealth troops. At the lower end of the cemetery, there is a memorial bearing an inscription attributed to English poet John Maxwell Edmonds called the Kohima Epitaph. To recite this epitaph, I call upon Defence Advisor at the Australian High Commission, Group Captain Adam Spinks. Group Captain Spinks, please.
The Kohima epitaph reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today."
Thank you, Group Captain Spinks. On the 15th of February 1942, at the Ford factory in Bukit Timah, the fate of Singapore was decided for the next 3.5 years. On that day, at 6:10 p.m., Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival surrendered Singapore unconditionally to the Japanese 25th Army. To mark this day in our history, the Defence Administrative Assistant at the Australian High Commission, Warrant Officer, Class 1, Peter Bryan, will ring the remembrance bell in memory of the countless men and women who had so selflessly given their lives in the Second World War. There will be one ring of the bell for each of the 5 years of the Pacific War, beginning in 1941 and ending in 1945. 1941, the outbreak of the Pacific War and the Malayan Campaign. 1942, the fall of Singapore. 1943, the start of the American island hopping campaign. 1944, the Battle of Kohima and the Battle of the Philippines. 1945, 15th August, the end of war. 'Thank you, Warrant Officer Bryan. We now come to the third reading, based on excerpts taken from the poem For the Fallen, written by Lawrence Binyon. Lawrence Binyon was an English poet and art critic. While working at the British Museum, he became deeply moved by the high rate of casualties in the First World War. In their honor, he wrote For the Fallen. The poem's fourth verse is now widely used during remembrance ceremonies and is inscribed on numerous war monuments. Upon completion of the poem, please repeat the last line. We will remember them. To read For the Fallen, I call upon the Defence Advisor at the British High Commission, Commander Ashley Spencer. Commander Spencer, please.
They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. they fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will now have the laying of wreaths. These wreaths of poppies have traditionally been used in commemoration ceremonies since the end of the First World War. They signify the blood that has been shed on the battlefields. At the completion of the official wreath laying, those who wish to lay private wreaths are welcome to do so, but please wait for my announcement. We now invite wreaths to be laid in the following order. Group 1, the guest of honor, Mr. Dilip Nair. Chairman of the Commemoration Committee, Mr. Jaya Ayadure. Representing Singapore's Ministry of Defence, Brigadier General Retired Winston Toh. Group 2, the Japanese Ambassador, His Excellency Jun Yamasaki. The Indian High Commissioner, His Excellency Kumaran Perasamy. The British High Commissioner, Her Excellency Cara Owen. Group 3, the Australian High Commissioner, His Excellency William Hodgman. The Canadian High Commissioner, His Excellency Jean-Dominique Erassi. The New Zealand Deputy High Commissioner, His Excellency Peter Kemp. Group 4, representing Singapore History Consultants and the Battlebox, Ms. Jaya Lachumi. Representing the Singapore Civil Defence Force, Lieutenant Colonel Jamal Ishak. Representing Sport Singapore, Dr. Nick Eplin. Representing Journeys Private Limited and Haw Par Villa, Ms. Savita Kashyap. Group 5, Assistant Chief of the Air Staff for Strategy, Royal Air Force, Air Vice Marshal Simon Edwards. Commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force, Lieutenant General L. Meinzinger. Head of Delegation to SA-22, Air Marshal B. Chandrasekhar, Indian Air Force, Air Commander Australia, Air Vice Marshal Joe Yavasi. We would now like to invite members of the public who wish to lay private wreaths to come forward. In the spirit of reconciliation and hope that mankind finds peaceful means of resolving conflict, we have invited students of the Japanese School Singapore to make suru, traditional paper cranes, to be laid alongside the poppy wreaths. The suru in Japanese culture symbolize hope and providence. In post-war Japan, suru are made as an act of remembrance and to signify a prayer for the war dead. Today, the poppy and the suru together represent remembrance of our collective war dead and our fervent wish for reconciliation among all former combatants. To lay the suru on behalf of the Japanese community in Singapore, I call upon the principal of the Japanese School Singapore, Ms. Susumi Yuko, and the Deputy General Manager of the Japanese School Singapore, Mr. Yamada Mitsuru. The last post was a bugle call that once signaled the end of the day, when the duty officer returned from the tour of the camp and quarters. In war, the last post signaled the close of a day of battle. For those who were wounded or separated from their forces, they would be able to follow the sound of the bugle call to find safety and rest. Today, the last post is played at military funerals as a final act of farewell, symbolizing that the duty of the dead soldier is over and that he can now rest in peace. Ladies and gentlemen, a recording of the last post will be played shortly. All are to rise and to remain standing. Uniformed personnel are to salute during the last post. After the last post, we will observe 2 minutes of silence in remembrance of our war dead. This will be followed by a recording of the rouse. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and remain standing for the last post. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We now come to the fourth reading, Tribute to Heroes. Tribute to Heroes was written by a Republic of Singapore Navy officer, Lieutenant Colonel Andy Tan, on the 11th of January 2005. Lieutenant Colonel Tan was then a directing staff at the Singapore Command and Staff College. The poem pays tribute to the courageous men and women from many lands who had fought in the defense of Malaya and Singapore. It also conveys the solemn determination of the present generation to ensure that history does not repeat itself. To read Tribute to Heroes, I call upon Staff Officer from the Operations Department at the Singapore Civil Defence Force, Captain Stacey Lian. Captain Lian, please.
Heroes fallen, not in vain. Arise, dragons and phoenixes, we know our pain. With gratitude, we are here to bear. Overflowing tributes we will share. To subsequent generations, sons and daughters, of sacrifices and courage that never flounders. British, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Chinese and Malays, an international assortment of many races fought for a land so defensively stark. A noble calling not for faint hearts. Jitra, Kuantan, Jurong and Serangoon, sailors, airmen, soldiers fought for 100 moons. Ships, aircrafts and tanks that never came, you fought and fought with tremendous pain. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered and outperformed, against all odds you weathered the ferocious storm. Acts of sacrifice and courage not for fame, you finally succumbed without any shame. This solemn occasion, we the youth declare, we can only pay tributes a minuscule debt. 15 Feb Pacific calls, may God have mercy on us as Singapore falls. This testament we forever bear, testimony of resolve that doesn't care. To lead, to excel, to overcome, we roar. To defend our country and sovereignty, we shall not fall.
Thank you, Captain Lian. Our final reading of the day will be Our Sons, commonly attributed to Kemal Atatürk. Atatürk was the founding father of modern Turkey. In the First World War, he commanded the Turkish forces at the Battle of Gallipoli. It is believed that Atatürk wrote Our Sons in 1934 in response to a letter from Australian and New Zealand mothers who had lost their sons at the Battle of Gallipoli. His words are a reminder to us of the importance of reconciliation in healing the wounds of war. To read Our Sons, I call upon the New Zealand Defence Advisor, Colonel Grant Motley. Colonel Motley, please.
Our sons, those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives. You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country, therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lay side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well.
Thank you, Colonel Motley. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now play the national anthem of Singapore, Majulah Singapura or Onward Singapore. In line with COVID-19 regulations, we will not be singing the national anthem. All uniformed personnel are to salute during the national anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and remain standing for the national anthem of Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. I would now like to invite the chairman of the Commemoration Committee, Mr. Jaya Yadure, to deliver the concluding remarks for today's ceremony. Mr. Jaya, please.
Guest of Honor, Mr. Dilip Nair, Your Excellencies, the High Commissioners of the Commonwealth, and the Ambassador for Japan, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. Why I remember today. I'm here today to remember the fallen. They lie 4,500 strong, buried around you, many far from the land of their birth. And what about the 24,000 that stand behind me on these columns? They have no known graves to comfort the families that they left behind. Today is their day. I remember today not to glorify war, but the men and women who went to war and their values. Man has an innate predilection to violence that unleashes unimaginable harm. And yet, it is also that man that possesses the nobility of the human spirit, a nobility that wills him to stand in harm's way to protect and defend the defenseless. I remember that man. For me, he speaks of the values of courage, loyalty, honor, and the love for one's country. I speak here today for the men and women of all nations who fought over this land in that campaign of 70 days. Thus, I recognize not just those who were native-born and who now inherit the land, but also the sacrifice made by both former allies and foe. We therefore recite our sons in the spirit of inclusivity and a recognition of our common laws. We also showed here today another way in which the Pacific War can be commemorated in the Indo-Pacific. Anniversaries of victory and defeat in this war often elicit the remembrance and rehashing of pain and the opening of old wounds, making them as fresh as yesterday. They add yet another layer of acrimony in contemporary relations between and amongst nations. Here in Southeast Asia, we reflect hope and peace for the future. We show that it is possible for former combatants of the Pacific War to come together to commemorate that while we do not ignore the past, we are not mired in it. It has been 77 years of peace amongst our nations, and today we show how nations once at war remember the past and yet look forward to the future together. Finally, I mark today so that my country, Singapore, a peaceful nation, can acquire a culture of remembrance so that its young honor those who sacrifice so much for our defense and security. More importantly, to acquire that culture without having to pay the bitter and bloody price of firing a bullet in anger. I would like to thank our guest of honor, Mr. Dilip Nair, for gracing us with his presence and thoughtful words. I would like to thank the members of the committee consisting of the 5 Commonwealth High Commissioners of Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, the Embassy of Japan, the Singapore Civil Defence Force, Sports Singapore, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Singapore History Consultants, and the Battlebox and Journeys Private Limited, and Haw Villa. The hard work that went to making this ceremony come alive was due to this committee. Special mention needs to be made of the Installation Auxiliary Police Force who have made this a very safe ceremony. The ceremony has also been made possible by a grant provided by the Singapore Tourism Board, Singapore History Consultants, and Journeys Private Limited. I thank them for their generous contribution. And ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for remembering with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Jaya. The resilience of our people that followed the fall of Singapore bear significant lessons for this generation. After all, we face uncertain times brought on by the pandemic and the rise of international tensions in Europe and Asia. May we remember the sacrifice made by so many in the Pacific War to allow us to chart our own destinies in peace and harmony. May we never forget the lessons of the past so that we can live in peace and prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of today's commemoration ceremony to mark the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. Thank you for participating here at home and overseas in today's ceremony. Have a good day and keep safe. Now, ladies and gentlemen, due to COVID-19 regulations, the different zones are not allowed to mingle in the cemetery. Please maintain social distancing as you leave the cemetery. You can collect bottled water at the registration table. You may also leave a message on our guest book at the front as you take your leave of this place. Okay, thank you very much. Have a great day.